The Pinot Noir was breathing on the counter, and the rain was drumming a steady, comforting rhythm against the windows of our Brooklyn brownstone, the perfect soundtrack for a solitary night, while my wife conquered the tech world in Chicago. Then the phone rang at 10:14 p.m., displaying an unknown Illinois number that shattered the quiet not with a scream, but with a polite, professional voice from hotel security asking to verify Mr. Vance's identity. In the span of a heartbeat, the silence of the house transformed from peaceful to predatory, hiding a secret that was about to scream. If the fragility of trust and the shadows hiding behind successful marriages intrigue you, stay with me. We are about to peel back the layers of a perfect life to see what really lies beneath, and you won't want to miss where this truth leads. The rain over Brooklyn had that specific, heavy quality that made the indoors feel like a sanctuary. Mark Vance stood by the kitchen island of his renovated brownstone, the granite cool under his fingertips, watching the water streak against the glass. It was Friday night, 10:14 p.m. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint, rhythmic hiss of cars passing on the wet asphalt outside. He took a sip of the Pinot Noir he'd opened 10 minutes ago. It was a 2018 vintage, the same year he and Elena had finally finished paying off the renovations. Tonight, Elena was 1,000 miles away in Chicago at the Global FinTech Summit. She had texted him 2 hours ago. Presentations ran late, exhausted, going to crash early, love you. Mark had replied with a heart emoji and a promise to handle the contractor meeting on Monday. He was a good husband. He knew this about himself not with arrogance, but with the steady assurance of a man who showed up, who listened, who remembered anniversaries. The phone on the counter buzzed, vibrating against the stone. The screen lit up, shattering the dim mood lighting. Unknown caller. Area code 312. Chicago. A spike of adrenaline, sharp and cold, pierced his chest. His first thought was an accident. A taxi skidding on slick streets. A medical emergency in a hotel room. He swiped answer, his grip on the wine glass tightening until his knuckles turned white. Elena? Mr. Mark Vance? The voice on the other end was male, deep, and clipped with professional authority. It wasn't a doctor. Yes, this is he. Is my wife okay? This is Mr. Henderson, head of security at the Drake Hotel in Chicago. I apologize for the late hour, sir, but we have a bit of a situation regarding the suite registered in your name. Mark exhaled, the panic subsiding into confusion. The suite? Is she hurt? No, sir. Mrs. Vance is perfectly fine, Henderson said, though there was a pause, a hesitation that felt heavy. The issue is with the in-room safe. We had a tamper alert triggered about 15 minutes ago. Security responded to the room. Mark frowned, setting the wine glass down, the red liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim. Okay. Did she forget the code? She does that sometimes. That's what we assumed, Henderson continued. However, the guest in the room, Mr. Vance, is quite agitated. He's insisting the mechanism is faulty. He's attempting to retrieve a watch, I believe. But since his identification didn't match the primary card holder on the folio, which is you, we couldn't perform the manual override without verbal verification. Mark stood very still. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to stop. The rain outside ceased to exist. I'm sorry, Mark said, his voice sounding hollow, like it was coming from someone else in the room. Could you repeat that? The guest, Henderson said, his tone shifting slightly, perhaps sensing the change in the air. The gentleman in the room with Mrs. Vance. He identified himself as her husband, Mr. Vance, but he couldn't produce a driver's license matching the booking. Standard protocol requires us to call the number on file before opening the safe for a second party. Mark looked at the reflection of his own kitchen. The copper pots hanging in an orderly row, the stack of mail on the counter, the life he had built brick by brick. It all looked the same, yet it was entirely different. "Sir?" Henderson asked. "We just need you to verify if we can grant access. The gentleman is quite insistent." Mark closed his eyes. He could picture the suite. He could picture Elena, wrapped in a hotel robe, perhaps standing by the window, while a man, Mr. Vance, argued with security about a watch. "Mr. Henderson," Mark said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register, "I need you to tell me exactly what this man looks like." "Sir, I don't think—" "Describe him," Mark commanded, the authority in his voice cutting through the miles of fiber optic cable. "He's tall, dark hair, wearing a gray suit, mid-40s. Julian." The name didn't need to be spoken. It hung in the air between New York and Chicago like a guillotine blade. Julian Thorne, Elena's VP of operations. The man she claimed was annoying but brilliant. The man Mark had had dinner with last Christmas. "Sir?" Henderson sounded uneasy now. "Is there a problem?" Mark opened his eyes. He looked at the empty space beside him where Elena should have been. "Mr. Henderson," Mark said, "do not open that safe. And tell the man claiming to be me that his wife is on the line." He didn't wait for a response. He just listened to the silence on the other end, a silence that confirmed the end of his life as he knew it. The line went dead before Mr. Henderson could respond. Or perhaps Mark had pressed the end button himself. He couldn't be sure. The silence that rushed back into the kitchen was absolute, swallowing the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythm of the rain. Mark stood frozen, the phone slippery in his palm, the screen dark. "Mr. Vance is quite agitated." The words echoed in his mind, looping like a corrupted audio file. For a fleeting minute, his brain scrambled to build a defense for her. Maybe Julian was in trouble. Maybe they were all in the room for a team meeting and Julian was playing a prank. Maybe it was a misunderstanding so profound that they would laugh about it over brunch on Sunday. But the Pinot Noir on the counter smelled like vinegar now. Mark moved, not with the frantic energy of a jealous husband, but with the slow, mechanical stiffness of a man walking underwater. He walked into the living room, where the glow of the streetlights filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long prison bar shadows across the floor. On the coffee table lay the family iPad, the screen smudged with fingerprints from when he'd looked up a recipe earlier that evening. He picked it up. The device felt heavy, cold aluminum against his sweating palms. He and Elena shared an iCloud account, a decision made years ago for convenience, for shared grocery lists and vacation albums. It was a testament to a marriage with no locked doors. He sat on the edge of the sofa, the cushion compressing with a soft sigh. He unlocked the screen and tapped the photos icon. The sync wheel spun for a second. Updating. 3 new photos appeared at the bottom of the stream. The first was innocuous, a view of the Chicago skyline from a high floor, rain blurring the city lights into impressionistic smears of gold and red. The second was a plate of food, oysters on a bed of ice, a silver bucket of champagne in the background. It was artistic, well composed, the kind of shot Elena would post to Instagram with a caption about hustle culture or treating the team. But Mark zoomed in. On the edge of the frame, resting on the white tablecloth, was a hand. It wasn't Elena's manicured hand. It was a man's hand, thick-wristed, wearing a heavy stainless steel watch with a blue face. Mark's breath hitched. A Omega Seamaster. Julian wore an Omega. He had shown it to Mark at the Christmas party, bragging about the vintage bezel. Mark swiped to the third photo. It wasn't a photo. It was a live photo. A 3-second video clip captured by accident. He pressed his thumb on the screen to animate it. The image moved. The camera jolted slightly, as if being set down on a table. Audio hissed into the quiet Brooklyn living room. The clatter of silverware, low jazz, and then a voice. Not Elena's professional voice, the one she used for clients. This was her other voice, the one Mark hadn't heard in years. Low, throaty, intimate. "Stop worrying about the bill, Jay. We're putting it on the room." Then a man's laugh. Deep, arrogant, possessive. "I love it when you spend their money on us." Mark lifted his thumb. The image froze back into a still life of oysters and champagne. He didn't throw the iPad. He didn't scream. He felt a strange, detached numbness spreading from his chest to his extremities, as if his body was shutting down non-essential functions to survive the trauma. It wasn't just tonight. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He began to scroll up, past the last month, past the summer. He looked at the dates of her previous business trips. San Francisco in March. Austin in November. He checked the metadata. Austin, November 14th. A selfie of Elena in a hotel mirror. In the background, a gray suit jacket thrown carelessly over the chair. San Francisco, March 2nd. A scenic shot of the Golden Gate Bridge, but the reflection in the sunglasses she was holding. A silhouette of a man taking the picture. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness induced by alcohol and proximity. It was a parallel life. For 2 years, while Mark had been sanding floors in their brownstone and planning their 10th anniversary, Elena had been building a separate world with Julian. They had routines. They had inside jokes. They had a financial system. The safe, Mark thought. He wanted the watch from the safe. The Omega. Julian had taken it off, perhaps before they went to bed, and locked it away. And now he was panicked because he couldn't get it back before Mark woke up in Brooklyn. Mark set the iPad down on the coffee table with extreme care, lining it up parallel to the edge. The orderliness of the action was a terrifying contrast to the chaos unraveling inside him. He stood up. The nausea was rising now, a sour tide in his throat. He walked to the kitchen sink and gripped the edge, breathing through his nose, forcing the bile down. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. He looked like a fool, a trusting, blind, pathetic fool. He couldn't stay in this house. The walls were covered in photos of a lie. The air felt recycled, stale with deceit. He pulled his phone from his pocket. His fingers, surprisingly steady now, opened the airline app. New York, JFK to Chicago, ORD. 0600 a.m. Departure. He booked the seat. One way. He wasn't going there to save his marriage. He wasn't going there to fight for her. He was going there because he needed to see the faces of the people who had murdered his life. And he needed to look them in the eye when they realized the body was no longer buried. Mark turned off the kitchen lights, plunging the house into darkness, and walked toward the stairs to pack a bag. JFK Terminal 4 at 5 o'clock a.m. was a purgatory of fluorescent lights and polished linoleum. Mark moved through the security line like a ghost, removing his shoes, his belt, his laptop, stripping away layers of himself with mechanical efficiency. The TSA agent barked instructions, a drone of authority that barely registered over the roaring static in Mark's head. He had packed a small duffel bag, 2 shirts, a change of underwear, and a shaving kit. Essentials for a business trip he didn't have. He hadn't slept. The hours between booking the ticket and leaving the brownstone had been a blur of pacing and staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to fail to rise. "Boarding Group A," the gate agent announced. Mark scanned his digital pass. The beep of the scanner sounded like an accusation. Invalid entry. Fraudulent husband. He found his seat, 4A, by the window. The cabin smelled of recycled air and stale coffee. He sat down, buckling the belt tight across his waist, needing the physical constriction to hold himself together. Outside, the tarmac was gray and wet. The ground crew moving in yellow vests, handling luggage with an indifference that Mark envied. They were just doing a job. They would go home to their families, or to empty apartments, but their lives were simple, linear. Mark closed his eyes as the engines began to whine. A memory hijacked him, unbidden and cruel. Tuesday morning, the foyer of their house. Elena had been checking her reflection in the hall mirror, adjusting the collar of her silk blouse, the cream one he had bought her for her birthday. "I hate leaving you," she had said, turning to him. She had reached up, smoothed his lapel, and kissed him. It hadn't been a peck. It had been a lingering, soft pressure. "The conference is going to be brutal. I'll probably be too tired to even talk at night." He had believed her. He had hugged her tight, smelling her perfume, Santal 33, and felt a swell of pride for his ambitious, hard-working wife. Now, as the plane accelerated down the runway, pressing him back into the seat, that memory curdled. She hadn't been smoothing his lapel. She had been acting. She hadn't been dreading the work. She had been anticipating the escape. The perfume wasn't for him, it was for Julian. The plane lifted, the wheels retracting with a heavy thud. Mark turned his head to the window, watching New York shrink into a grid of lights and concrete. Somewhere down there was his office, his garden designs, his favorite coffee shop, the geography of a man who thought he knew where he belonged. "Sir, would you like a beverage?" Mark startled, turning to see a flight attendant hovering with a cart. She had a kind, tired smile. "Water," Mark croaked. His throat felt like it was filled with sand. "Just water, please." He took the plastic cup, his hand trembling slightly. He stared at the water, watching the ripples caused by the plane's vibration. 2 years. The timeline was what gutted him. If it had been a drunken one-night stand, a moment of weakness at a holiday party, perhaps he could have understood the biology of it. But 2 years meant calculation. It meant every time she had come home late, every business dinner, every time she had been too tired for intimacy with him, she had been saving herself for someone else. It meant she had looked him in the eye over breakfast, discussed their retirement savings, planned their summer vacation to Maine, all while carrying the weight of another man's touch. How did she do it? How did she compartmentalize so perfectly? Mark felt a wave of nausea roll through him, hot and sudden. He gripped the armrests, breathing deeply through his nose. He imagined Julian's hand on the small of her back. He imagined them laughing in the hotel elevator, the doors closing on the world, closing on him. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into O'Hare. The flight had been less than 3 hours, but it felt like he had aged a decade. Below him, Chicago sprawled out, a vast gray grid hugging the curve of the lake. It looked cold, industrial, a fortress of steel and secrets. The wheels touched down with a screech of rubber, the reverse thrusters roaring. The plane slowed, taxiing toward the terminal. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin instantly filled with the sound of buckles clicking and people shuffling for their bags. Mark didn't move immediately. He pulled his phone from his pocket and turned off airplane mode. It searched for a signal. 1 bar, 2 bars, LTE. Notifications flooded in. Emails from his assistant. A spam text about a car warranty. A news alert. Nothing from Elena. It was 7:15 a.m. Central Time. She was likely still asleep. Or maybe she was awake, ordering room service. Oysters for breakfast? Champagne? In the suite he had paid for. With the man she loved enough to destroy everything for. Mark stood up, slinging his duffel bag over his shoulder. He walked down the aisle, stepping out of the pressurized tube and into the terminal. The air here smelled different, sharper, metallic. He wasn't Mark Vance, the landscape architect, anymore. He was a surveillance instrument. He walked toward the exit, the rhythm of his footsteps syncing with the pounding in his chest. He wasn't going to call her. He wasn't going to text. He was just coming to watch. The Drake Hotel stood at the top of the magnificent mile like an old-world sentinel, its limestone facade resisting the biting wind coming off Lake Michigan. Mark stepped out of the taxi, the collar of his coat turned up against the chill. He didn't have a reservation. He didn't have luggage, really. Just the duffel bag that made him look like a wayward traveler or a man leaving a life behind. He pushed through the revolving doors and was instantly enveloped by the scent of fresh floral arrangements and old money. The lobby was a cavern of Italian Renaissance splendor, chandeliers dripping with crystal, wood paneling that had absorbed a century of secrets, and the hushed, confident murmur of wealth. Mark felt acutely out of place. He felt like a jagged edge in a room full of smooth surfaces. He found a seat in the palm court, positioned behind a large potted fern that offered a direct line of sight to the main elevator bank. It was 8:15 a.m. The breakfast rush was beginning. Businessmen in sharp suits checked their watches. Tourists in North Face jackets fumbled with maps. Mark ordered a black coffee from a passing server. When it arrived, he didn't touch it. He just wrapped his cold hands around the porcelain cup, using the heat to ground himself. He watched the brass arrows above the elevator doors swing left and right. Ding. A family of 4. Ding. An elderly couple. Ding. A flight crew. Every time the doors opened, his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was terrified of seeing her. He was terrified of not seeing her. 8:38 a.m. The far left elevator chimed. The heavy doors slid open with a smooth, hydraulic hiss. Mark stopped breathing. Julian walked out first. He looked exactly as Mark remembered, perhaps even better. He was wearing the gray suit from the photo, crisp and tailored, no tie. He looked rested, energized, the master of his domain. He held the door open with a casual, practiced grace. And then Elena stepped out. Mark's vision tunneled. She was wearing a navy wrap dress he had never seen before. Something professional but fitted, cut to accentuate a silhouette he thought he knew by heart. Her hair was loose, not pulled back in the severe bun she usually wore for work trips. She looked light. That was the only word for it. She didn't look exhausted from late-night presentations, She looked radiant. They didn't kiss. They didn't hold hands. It was worse than that. As they walked toward the concierge desk, Julian leaned in slightly to say something, and Elena tilted her head toward him. A magnetic pull that spoke of deep, established familiarity. She laughed. A genuine, open-mouthed laugh that Mark hadn't earned in months. Julian reached out and adjusted the strap of her tote bag on her shoulder, his fingers brushing her neck for a fraction of a second too long. It wasn't a sexual grope. It was a gesture of care. It was the kind of thing a husband does. Mark felt a physical crack in his chest. If they Palman had been sneaking around, looking guilty, looking over their shoulders, he might have been able to categorize this as a sordid fling. But they walked through the lobby as if they owned it. They walked like a couple who had woken up together, shared the bathroom, and were now discussing their day. They possessed an ease that only comes with time. They stopped at the concierge desk. Mark watched as Julian spoke to the staff, pointing at a brochure. Elena stood beside him, checking her phone, then held the screen up for Julian to see. He nodded, said something that made her smile again, and then placed his hand on the small of her back to guide her away from the desk. The intimacy of it was suffocating. Mark realized then that he wasn't just watching his wife cheat. He was watching his wife live a completely different life. A life where she was happier, looser, more alive. He was the anchor she dragged around in New York. Julian was the wind here in Chicago. They turned toward the Camellia Room for breakfast. They were walking away from him, but they were also walking away from everything Mark and Elena had built. Mark stood up. His legs felt like lead. The coffee on the table was still full, a dark, untouched pool. He couldn't just sit here anymore. The passive observer was dying, replaced by a man who needed to shatter the glass. He picked up his duffel bag. He didn't run. He walked with a terrifyingly calm purpose, following the ghost of his marriage across the plush carpet. The distance between the Palm Court and the concierge desk was perhaps 50 feet, but for Mark, it felt like crossing a minefield where the only explosive was the truth. He could hear the hum of the hotel, the clink of porcelain, the murmur of guests, but his focus narrowed down to the backs of the two people standing at the mahogany counter. Julian was leaning one elbow on the high desk, his posture relaxed, entitled. He was speaking to the young woman behind the computer, a concierge named Sarah, according to her brass name tag. "We were hoping to extend the reservation for the corner suite through Sunday," Julian said. His voice was smooth, carrying the easy confidence of a man spending someone else's time. "My wife and I have found the city hard to leave." Elena stood next to him, nodding. She reached out and touched Julian's arm, a reflex of agreement. "And if we could get that late checkout? We have a flight to catch, but we didn't want to rush breakfast." "Let me check availability for you, Mr. Vance," the concierge replied with a professional smile, her fingers clattering over the keyboard. The name hung in the air. Mr. Vance. It wasn't just a pseudonym. It was an identity theft of the soul. Julian hadn't just taken his wife. He had taken his place in the world. He was using Mark's name to buy intimacy, to secure luxury, to validate their affair. Mark stopped 2 feet behind them. He didn't tap them on the shoulder. He didn't grab Elena's arm. He waited for the concierge to look up. When Sarah's eyes lifted from the screen, they widened slightly as they landed on the man standing directly behind her current guests. Mark held her gaze. He didn't look crazy. He didn't look violent. He looked like a man who had come to collect a debt. I believe, Mark said, his voice low, steady, and terrifyingly polite. There might be some confusion regarding that request. Elena froze. It wasn't a flinch. It was a total cessation of movement, as if her nervous system had simply severed the connection to her muscles. Julian turned first. His expression was one of mild annoyance, the look of a man interrupted by a stranger, before his eyes locked onto Mark's face. The recognition was instant. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a pallor that made his tan look gray. Slowly, painfully, Elena turned. Her face was a study in devastation. The color vanished from her cheeks. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The radiant, light woman Mark had watched from the shadows was gone, replaced by a ghost. She looked at Mark, then at Julian, then back at Mark, her eyes darting as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. "Mark?" she whispered. The word was so quiet, it was almost swallowed by the lobby music. It sounded like a question, as if she couldn't quite believe he was real. Mark didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the concierge, who was now looking between the three of them with growing alarm. "I'm Mark Vance," Mark said to Sarah, pulling his driver's license from his coat pocket and sliding it across the marble counter. The plastic clicked against the stone. "The actual Mark Vance, and I'd like to cancel the extension on the suite. In fact, I'd like to check out immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the immediate vicinity. The guests walking by didn't notice. The world kept turning. But in that 5-foot radius, the universe had collapsed. Julian straightened up, trying to regain some semblance of composure. He cleared his throat, adjusting his jacket, but his hands were trembling. "Mark, look, this isn't—" Mark turned his head slowly to look at Julian. He didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at him with a dead, flat stare that communicated a violence far deeper than a punch. "Don't speak," Mark said. "You're wearing my name. You're sleeping in my room. But you are not me. So unless you want me to ask security to verify the contents of that safe right now, you will not say another word." Julian's mouth snapped shut. The threat of the safe, the stolen time, the hidden watch, the tangible proof of their deceit hit its mark. Elena reached out a hand toward Mark, her fingers shaking. "Mark, please, not here." Mark looked at her hand, the hand he had held at their wedding, the hand he had held in the hospital when her mother died, the hand he had seen in a photo next to a plate of oysters. He took a half step back, putting just enough distance between them to make her touch impossible. "No," Mark said. "Not here. There is a meeting room down the hall. I rented it for an hour. We're going there." He turned back to the stunned concierge. "Thank you. We'll sort this out." He turned and walked toward the corridor, not waiting to see if they followed. He knew they would. They had no choice. The fantasy was over. Now came the autopsy. The meeting room Mark had rented was a soulless box of beige walls and fluorescent lighting, designed for quarterly reviews and budget planning, not the dissection of a marriage. A pitcher of ice water sat sweating on the center of the mahogany table, surrounded by empty leather chairs. Mark walked in first and held the door. Julian entered with a hesitant shuffle. His earlier confidence evaporated. Elena came last. She walked with her head high, but her hands were clenched at her sides, the knuckles white. Mark closed the door. The latch clicked, a sharp, final sound that sealed them inside. "Sit," Mark said. He didn't sit himself. He stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the back of a chair, grounding himself. Julian pulled out a chair for Elena, but she ignored him and moved to the window, staring out at the gray Chicago sky. Julian awkwardly took a seat halfway down the table, leaving a vast, empty expanse of wood between him and Mark. "How long?" Mark asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of the last 12 hours. Elena didn't turn around. Her reflection in the glass was ghostly, translucent against the concrete city. 2 years, she said softly. 2 years, Mark repeated. So, the trip to Austin, San Francisco, the weekend in D.C. when you said the flight was canceled. Yes. Mark looked at Julian. The other man was studying the grain of the table, unable to meet Mark's eyes. Why? Mark asked. We were happy. We were building a life. We just finished the house. We were talking about... We were boring, Mark. Elena spun around. The outburst was sudden, cracking the sterile silence. Her eyes were wet, but not with tears of repentance. They were bright with a defensive anger. We were safe, she said, her voice trembling. We were so incredibly, painfully safe. Every day was the same coffee, the same dinner, the same conversations about the garden and the mortgage. I felt like I was drowning in comfort. I felt dead. She gestured toward Julian, who flinched slightly. With him, I wasn't the wife. I wasn't the responsible project manager. I was someone else. I was dangerous. We took risks. I felt alive, Mark. I'm sorry, but I felt alive. Mark stared at her. He felt a cold hollow opening up in his stomach. He had given her stability, loyalty, and love, and she had despised him for it. She had interpreted his devotion as stagnation. So you brought him into our life, Mark said quietly. You let him wear my name. You let him sleep in my place. Julian cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Look, Mark, I know this looks bad, but I didn't know you were still involved. Mark turned his gaze slowly to Julian. Excuse me? Julian looked up, confusion knitting his brow. He looked from Mark to Elena. Elena told me you were separated. She said you were living in the guest room. She said you were just keeping up appearances for the families until after the holidays. The room went silent. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to roar. Mark looked at Elena. She had turned back to the window, her shoulders hunched. Is that true? Mark asked. Elena didn't answer. She told me the divorce papers were being drafted, Julian continued, his voice gaining a little more strength, a little more indignation. She said you guys had an arrangement, that you were roommates. I wouldn't have... I'm not a monster. I wouldn't have done this if I knew you were waiting at home with dinner. Mark laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound that hurt his throat. Roommates, Mark said. Tuesday morning, she kissed me goodbye. Last week, we booked a trip to Maine for our anniversary. We share a bank account. We share a bed. Julian stood up slowly. He looked at Elena with a dawning expression of horror. He realized, finally, that he wasn't the dashing savior rescuing a woman from a dead marriage. He was a prop. He was a tool she used to feel excitement, built on a foundation of lies she told to both of them. You lied to me, Julian said to Elena's back. You said it was over. You said he didn't care. Elena turned around, her face streaked with tears now. I couldn't lose you, she whispered to Julian. Then she looked at Mark, and I couldn't leave you. I wanted both. I needed both. Mark looked at them, the weeping wife and the bewildered lover. They looked small. They looked pathetic. The cinematic romance he had imagined in the lobby, the sophisticated affair. It was just a mess of cowardice and selfishness. You didn't want both, Mark said, his voice devoid of emotion. You just didn't want to be the bad guy. So you made me the boring husband to him, and you made him the invisible ghost to me. Mark walked over to the door. He felt lighter, strangely. The mystery was gone. There was no grand passion here, only a woman who was too weak to be honest. I'm done listening, Mark said. Mark, wait. Elena took a step forward. Where are you going? I'm going to the airport, Mark said. He looked at Julian. You can keep the suite. I'm sure you have a lot to talk about. Mark walked down the hallway, his footsteps absorbed by the thick, patterned carpet. The silence of the hotel corridor felt oppressive, a sharp contrast to the noise inside his head that was suddenly, miraculously, beginning to quiet. Mark, stop! Elena's voice cracked behind him. The heavy door of the meeting room banged against the wall, followed by the rapid staccato of her heels. She caught up to him at the elevator bank, her hand clamping onto his forearm. Her grip was desperate, her nails digging into his coat. He stopped, but he didn't turn to face her immediately. He looked at her hand on his sleeve, the familiar shape of her fingers, the ring he had placed there 10 years ago. It looked like a foreign object. You can't just walk out, she gasped, breathless. Scream at me. Hit something. Do something, Mark. Don't just disappear. Mark slowly peeled her fingers off his arm. He turned to face her. Her face was flushed, her eyes searching his for the rage she felt she deserved. Rage would have been comforting. Rage would have meant there was still passion, still something worth burning down. I'm not going to scream, Elena, he said. His voice was calm, tired. Screaming implies I'm trying to fix this. It implies I want you to hear me. I made a mistake, she pleaded, tears spilling over now. I got lost. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't make a mistake, Mark corrected her gently. You made a choice. Every single day for 2 years, you woke up and made a choice. You chose to lie when you poured my coffee. You chose to lie when you texted me goodnight. You curated a life where I was the safety net, and he was the trapeze. Down the hall, Julian was, standing in the doorway of the meeting room. He looked small, stripped of his mystery. He wasn't the dashing executive anymore. He was just a man in a rumpled suit who had been tricked into thinking he was rescuing a damsel, only to find out he was the getaway driver. Mark looked at Julian, then back at Elena. You said you felt dead with me, Mark said. I'm sorry for that. But you know what? I was alive. I was happy. I was building a future for us while you were auditioning for a different life. He pressed the call button for the elevator. The light dinged instantly. Mark, please, she sobbed, stepping closer, trying to use her physical proximity, the weapon that had worked for a decade. We can fix this. I'll quit the job. I'll cut him off. We can go to therapy. Mark looked at her, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical weight being lifted. I don't know this woman. The Elena he loved, the one who liked old jazz and burnt toast, had died 2 years ago. He had been mourning her without knowing it, feeling the distance grow, mistaking it for the settling of a long marriage when it was actually the rigor mortis of their bond. I don't want to fix it, Mark said. It's not broken, Elena. It's gone. The elevator doors slid open. A mirrored interior reflected the three of them: the crying wife, the awkward lover in the distance, and the husband who was no longer a husband. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out the electronic key card to the suite. The room he had paid for. The room where they had drunk champagne and laughed about him. He held it out to her. "Here," he said. She stared at the plastic card, confused. "What?" "The room is paid for until Sunday," Mark said. He pressed the card into her trembling hand. "You wanted that life. You wanted the excitement. You wanted him." He gestured down the hall toward Julian. "He's all yours. No more sneaking around. No more lies. You have exactly what you wanted. Good luck." "Mark, don't," she whispered, the horror setting in. She realized what he was doing. He wasn't punishing her with anger. He was punishing her with freedom. He was leaving her there, in the cold light of day, with the reality of her affair stripped of the thrill of the forbidden. Mark stepped into the elevator and turned around. He looked at her one last time. She stood there clutching the key card, looking back at Julian, who offered a weak, uncertain shrug. The romance was already evaporating, replaced by the crushing weight of logistics and guilt. "Goodbye, Elena," Mark said. He pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, cutting off the image of his wife standing in the hallway, looking smaller than he had ever seen her. As the elevator descended, Mark leaned his head back against the mirrored wall and closed his eyes. He didn't cry. He just took a deep breath, and for the first time in 2 years, the air didn't taste like someone else's secrets. 6 months later, the air in Brooklyn tasted different. It was May, and the damp chill of that Chicago morning had been replaced by the sweet, humid promise of late spring. Mark knelt in the dirt, the knees of his work trousers stained dark with damp soil. He was working on a small courtyard project in Cobble Hill, a renovation for a young couple who wanted sanctuary. It was a word Mark understood differently now. Sanctuary wasn't about high walls or locked safes. It was about what you planted inside the perimeter. He dug his trowel into the earth, hitting a stubborn knot of old roots. They were dead, leftovers from a boxwood hedge that had succumbed to blight years ago, yet they still clung to the soil with obstinate strength. Mark gripped the root ball with his gloved hands. He pulled. It resisted. He gritted his teeth, feeling the strain in his shoulders, the physical exertion clearing his mind in a way no whiskey ever could. With a final wet snap, the dead roots gave way. He tossed the withered clump onto the compost pile. "Out with the old," he murmured to himself. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his forearm. On the wrought iron patio table behind him, weighted down by a brick to keep it from fluttering in the breeze, lay a thick manila envelope. It had arrived yesterday via courier. The return address was a law firm in Midtown. Mark stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. He walked over to the table and picked up his water bottle, taking a long drink. He looked at the envelope. Inside were the final divorce decrees, waiting for his signature. The brownstone was gone. He had sold it 2 months after the trip to Chicago. He couldn't stay there. Surrounded by the ghosts of meals they had shared and the phantom echo of her phone vibrating on the counter. He had bought a smaller place, a loft in Red Hook, with big windows and no history. It was a blank slate. He picked up the pen he had left beside the envelope. He thought about Elena. He didn't hate her. The fiery rage he had expected to consume him had burned out quickly, leaving behind a gray, ash-like indifference. He heard through mutual friends that she was still in Chicago, living with Julian. He also heard it wasn't going well, that without the thrill of secrecy, their relationship was buckling under the weight of mundane reality. Julian wasn't a savior. He was just a man who didn't like to do dishes, and Elena wasn't a reckless romantic heroine. She was just a woman who had blown up her life because she was bored. Mark clicked the pen. He didn't feel a pang of loss. He felt the specific, sharp relief of a diagnosis. For 2 years, he had been living with a sickness he couldn't name. The distance, the coldness, the unexplainable solitude in a shared bed. Now the sickness was gone. The surgery was over. He was just healing. He flipped to the last page, past the division of Yas assets and the legalese defining the end of a decade. He found the line marked petitioner. He signed his name, Mark Vance. The ink flowed smoothly. His hand didn't shake. It was just a signature, no different than signing for a package or approving a landscape blueprint. He capped the pen and placed the papers back in the envelope. It was done. Mark turned back to the garden. The empty hole where the dead boxwood had been was waiting. Beside him sat a flat of new plantings. Heuchera, with their resilient purple leaves, and shade-loving ferns that thrived even when the light was scarce. He picked up a young fern, teasing out its white, healthy roots before placing it into the ground. He packed the fresh soil around it, firm and secure. It would take time for it to establish. It would need water and care, and seasons of sun and rain. But it would grow. It would survive the winter. Mark stood up and looked at his work. The garden was beginning to take shape. It wasn't the garden he had before. That one was manicured, perfect, and rot-infested underneath. This one was wilder, simpler, and real. The wind rustled the new leaves, a sound like a whisper. Mark took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the smell of turned earth and green things growing. He was 42 years old. He was alone, and for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He picked up his trowel. There was still work to do.